Well, good morning, church family, and thank you for being with us today. And I'm looking forward to our Bible study time that we have as we gather together as God's people to worship God, not in our traditional way, unable to be in person, but still we are a family of believers. We're still connected to one another, and I'm so glad that you're able to be with us. Today, I was wanting to continue in our sermon series in the book of First Peter, and it's a series that we've called The Fiery Trials, looking at what it means to develop a struggle well faith. And Peter has been working at trying to give us the ingredients that are necessary in order to persevere during tough times. And ultimately, what has to develop within us is the struggle well faith. And we've come to a section in Peter's letter where he wants to speak directly into our lives. Specifically, he wants to speak into our family life and tell us of what it looks like and what it means to struggle well as a family. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to put a focus on our families. And we're going to begin today with a focus on our marriages. Peter's going to give us two general commands in our text today from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. One command for wives, one command for husbands. But I want you to realize that these commands are not exclusive to the marriage relationship. In fact, the things that Peter's going to talk about are just as essential in our relationship with Jesus Christ. And so this is a lesson that while the context is speaking to marriage, it really has an application for all of us, no matter where you are in life. So for those of us that are married, this message is going to take a dual meaning for us because it's going to not only address our relationship with our spouse, but it also is going to speak to our relationship with Jesus. And to the rest of you that are not married, this message is going to help you understand the kind of relationship that Jesus is wanting to have with you. And so let's spend some time looking at the text. And we're going to begin by looking at what Peter has to say to the wives. And this is found in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Peter says, "Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and the reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from the outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes, but it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands." And so here's the demand that Peter gives to wives. Peter says, wives, you need to submit to your husbands. Now, I know we've heard this before, and this word submission is a word that has been misunderstood and abused throughout history. But I think it's important for us to notice the context in which Peter is demanding for wives to be submissive. It's found in these four words there in verse 1, when Peter says, "in the same way." Well, what is the same way? What does Peter mean when he's talking about the same way? Well, all you have to do is go back to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 21 through 23, and you'll get a clear understanding of what Peter is referring to when he talks about in the same way. Here's what he says, 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 21. "For God called you to do good, even if it means suffering, just as Christ suffered for you. He is your example, and you must follow in his steps. He never sinned nor ever deceived anyone. He did not retaliate when he was insulted, nor threaten revenge when he suffered. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly." And so we see here that the idea of submission is about placing oneself under another. It's placing ourselves in an exposed position, making one weaker. But it's not weaker in the sense of physically weaker or mentally weaker or emotionally weaker or even spiritually weaker, but rather the weakness that is found in the act of submission is a positional weakness. In fact, the language that Peter uses here is the same language that Paul used in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 when he spoke about the relationship between Jesus and God. And here's what Paul says. He says, then when all things are under his authority, the Son will put himself under God's authority, so that God, who gave his Son authority over all things, will be utterly supreme over everything, everywhere. And so here, Paul's saying to us that here Jesus has all authority. Everything is given to him. And then he turns around and he puts himself under the Father. Now, you got to just let that sink in for a moment. The Creator placed himself under his creation. The highest being in the universe made himself the lowest form of who we are. Jesus became the weaker vessel for us. And it's in this context that Peter says, wives, submit to your own husbands. Here's what Peter is telling wives to do. Peter's saying, you need to play the role of Jesus in your marriage by submitting to your husbands. And I'm convinced that the submitting is not to the superior status of a husband in the relationship. It's not that the husband is the final word in every decision that will be made within that marriage, but rather you submit yourself to the husband who is fulfilling his godly responsibilities as the husband, which is to be a source of comfort, a nurturer, a protector, a provider, of one who has the best interests of his wife and of his family. And what Peter is saying is that wives, you need to put yourself under that kind of love, that kind of sacrifice, that type of devotion from your husbands. Now, the problem is that husbands, we don't always live up to that standard. We're not always the nurturer. We're not always the comforter, the provider, the protector. We don't always put our wives and our children's interests above our own. And so that's a struggle, and that's an issue that we need to approach and talk about. But what Peter wants the wives to know is that you have a responsibility, and it's a choice that you get to make. And the choice is not about losing your identity. It's not about seeing yourself as being inferior. It's not becoming some spineless doormat in a relationship, but rather you see your role of Jesus in your marriage through the act of submission. And so Peter says, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. And you can clearly see how this principle is universal for all of us when it comes to our relationship with Jesus Christ. In fact, to really have a thriving relationship with Christ, the main requirement that we have to do is to surrender ourselves. We have to take on the attitude and the mindset of submission if we're ever going to have a real meaningful relationship with Jesus. And so Peter reminds us of the importance of submission. But then Peter turns his attention after giving the wives that demand of submission. And he says, now let me talk to you husbands. And here's what Peter says to the husbands. In the same way, you husbands must give honor to your wives. Treat your wife with understanding as you live together. She may be weaker than you are, but she is your equal partner in God's gift of new life. Treat her as you should, so your prayers will not be hindered. Notice again that Peter uses the very same language when talking to the husbands. He uses again that phrase, in the same way, which once again brings us right back to the example of Jesus, of how Jesus put others before himself, how Jesus sought what was best for humanity, not necessarily what was best for himself. And what Peter is doing here is that he is calling on husbands to step up and play the role of Jesus in your marriage, but not through the act of submission, but rather through the act of giving honor. You honor your wives as equal partners in God's gift of new life. You see, everything Peter is telling us to do is connected to Jesus' story, which is why Peter reminds us back in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24, that he, being Jesus, he personally carried our sins in his body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live to what is right. By his wounds, you were healed. Peter tells husbands that the way you respond to a Christ-like wife is to honor her as your equal partner in God's amazing gift of new life. And once again, not only is this the demand that Peter gives for husbands in the marriage relationship, but this is a demand that touches all of us when it comes to our relationship with Jesus. Not only do we submit ourselves to Jesus, but we also strive to live lives that honor Jesus for who he is. And so Peter, speaking to us as God's people, and specifically to our families, tells us that in order for us to function and to develop a struggle-well faith to get through the fiery trials, we need to practice the discipline of submission and of honoring. And my prayer for our families at UCC, and my prayer for our families in our Conway community and around this world, is that more of us will practice the discipline of submission and honoring, not only in our marriages, but also in our relationship with Jesus Christ. I want to close our thoughts today with Peter's closing words in 1 Peter chapter 2, because I think that we need this reminder, not only as we look at our marriages and our families and we try to cope with just the day-to-day struggles and the interruptions to the routines and the things that come with just doing life in family, but specifically to what's happened in our communities, what's taking place right now, what's not allowing us to be together as a family. I think these words are comforting words for us. Look how Peter ends chapter 2 in 1 Peter. He says, once you were like sheep who wandered away, but now you have turned to your shepherd, the guardian of your souls. And friends, that's my prayer and my hope for all of us today, is that we are a people who are turning to the shepherd, that we are turning to the one who is the guardian of our souls. I want to close our time today by sharing with you a powerful phrase. And I think of this as my prayer for you today as we continue to deal with the COVID-19, the coronavirus outbreak, and just the interruptions and the uncertainty and the concerns and all the things that are just building up in our lives. And we need to turn to God, and we need to know that God is in control, that God is present, and that He's here. And so I find comfort in these amazing words in Numbers chapter 6, in verses 24 through verse 26. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord show you His favor and give you His peace. May God bless you this week, and we look forward to the day that we will be able to all be together once again in person. But until then, please remain safe and know that you are deeply missed and you are greatly loved, not only by God, but by my family, by the UCC church family, and you are in our thoughts and prayers. May God bless you all. Have a good day.